Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Kozak. I'm a project manager at the Center for Planning Excellence. I'm excited to share some of our work with you and want to thank the ASFPM for giving me this opportunity. Today, I'm sharing a tool we created, a game, with funding support from the Foundation for Louisiana. We found that this tool is highly effective at starting conversations on a challenging topic, and it encourages participants to consider stormwater management strategies, land use decisions, and thinking beyond the boundaries of jurisdictional lines on a map. So you probably have a couple of questions with that intro. First, I'd like to address those questions by covering who is CPEX, answer the question, why did we make a watershed game in the first place? And then I'd like to frame up the workshop that we do with prior to this game, and then talk about the game, and then share some key takeaways and observations we've had while playing the game. So first, the Center for Planning Excellence, we champion the power of good planning to build healthy, sustainable communities throughout Louisiana through our work as policy advocates, educators, and consultants. We are the state's only nonprofit organization that coordinates urban, rural, and regional planning efforts. We provide best practice planning models, innovative policy ideas, and master plans. And a big part of our focus is on data-driven planning, both quantitative and qualitative. We're able to do this work because we have an experienced team with a diverse skill set of policy specialists, community planners, landscape architects, environmental scientists, and resilience and adaptation experts. Second question, why did we make a watershed game? Well, we created the game to bring flood risk reduction measures in the form of policies and programs to the public, decision makers, stakeholders, just about anybody else you can think of. We wanted to raise awareness about, as planners, we wanted to raise awareness about how our development patterns sometimes contribute to our flood risk. And finally, we created the game because in the state, there's a significant and demonstrated flood risk. More than half of Louisiana is a special flood hazard area. And because of outdated FEMA flood maps, land loss, relative sea level rise, we know that that's likely a conservative estimate. And this was clearly demonstrated in 2016. When two unnamed storm systems, one in March and one in August, dropped a lot of rain across the state. 56 of 64 parishes were declared federal disaster areas, and the total cost estimates range from $10 to $15 billion in damages. In a state that's used to natural disasters that come from named storms, these two events in 2016 were a real eye-opener as to just how much flood risk there existed across the state, not just on the coast. So the state's response to those 2016 floods is the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. It was established through an executive order that created a Council on Watershed Management that tapped 5 state agencies with working together to improve floodplain management and reduce flood risk statewide. It's an explicit recognition that a more comprehensive approach to reducing flood risk is necessary, and it calls for a watershed-based floodplain management program. But there's a lot to unpack there. We know that a major component of watershed management, whether the focus is on water quality, water quantity, is land use, and those decisions are made locally. We also know that watersheds rarely conform to jurisdictional boundaries. So there's the challenge of coordinating across jurisdictions, not to mention negotiating existing top-down, bottom-up relationships. So as a planning organization in Louisiana, we knew we needed to get some insight into local needs as the statewide effort rolled out. So to do that, we conducted a lot of interviews with floodplain managers, building officials, elected officials, scientists, private industry, planners, other outreach organizations, just to gauge local needs for an effort such as this. It was effectively an interview version of a needs assessment. What we heard all had the same common theme: education. Education for stakeholders, education for city council members, education for city and parish staff, education for the general public. So what did we do? We made an educational game as an activity to do at a workshop setting. We knew it needed to be flexible, both to account for changing geographies and audience. We also knew we need a front-end piece, an introduction to some of the concepts in the game, as well as background info on the challenges being addressed. So it's a game that comes with a lecture. How fun. Now, this next several slides might be preaching to the choir, but they demonstrate the general subject matter we covered in workshops to help provide an introduction to the base level information needed to fully engage in a game. We have this presentation at the front end, and then as you play in the game, you're reintroduced to these ideas at the latter end. And so there's like two touch points for learning some of these concepts and really thinking critically about them. So first, of course, we introduced the concept of a watershed, real basic definition. It's the entire area that contributes water to flooding and storm events. A big part of our focus is on flooding as opposed to water quality, because that's the focus of Louisiana's approach. But you could also easily have this be about water quality as well. Then we briefly describe watershed management. That's something that incorporates all land use and water management practices and policies within a watershed. It's really a holistic approach. This requires a consideration of impacts of infrastructure projects, development, industry, land use, on water quantity, quality, water supply, and environmental quality. Importantly, it forces you to think about upstream and downstream impacts. And the important point we're trying to make here is that managing flood risk and managing stormwater is not just limited to floodplains. Which brings us to floodplains. Now, this is a tricky one because people have generally heard the term, and there's a lot of different versions of definitions of this, and people understand it to varying degrees. And for the most part, they may all be right. Now, some may give you the location-based topographic definition of a floodplain. Others may focus more on the composition of materials that make up a floodplain and give the geomorphological definition. Some may focus on how often the area is covered in water and give the hydrological definition. Others might be plant people and identify more closely with the ecological definition. Now, while none of these folks would be wrong with these definitions, they pose a problem for community decision-making. None of them give us much structure for making a decision in a community. They don't set a specific area, identify a rain event, or a quantity of water we're dealing with. For that, we need to go to the regulatory definition, the FEMA definition. It gives a specific area determined by a specific quantity of water. It's hydrologically based, and it guides local decisions and regulates activity, right? So this is that key distinction we're trying to make here. Floodplains are a regulated area. There's a responsible jurisdiction for floodplains. There are specific rules for floodplains. This is not always the case for watersheds, okay? And it's the exception to the rule. In most cases, there is no responsible jurisdiction at the watershed scale. Watershed management requires considering all of the actions and decisions made throughout the watershed. So not only does it require coordination across jurisdictions along the lines that water flows, it will also involve decisions made in areas that typically are not associated with water management, such as housing, economic development, transportation. These are because some of the distinctions we really try and drive home in the front piece to these workshops. But we also want to point out that that's a really difficult effort that you need to undertake, because we've created a pretty complicated landscape for coordinating all of the activities that go on in a watershed. Take, for example, the parishes in the state of Louisiana. Nearly all of them straddle watershed boundaries. If we hone in on a more local level, here we're looking at East Baton Rouge Parish. There's 2 Huck 8 watersheds that are in East Baton Rouge Parish. If we add incorporated places, we now have 4 more jurisdictions. 3 of them are straddling multiple watersheds. If we add in lower house districts, we chop up this map even more. If we add in upper house districts, it gets to be a pretty complicated picture. So there's a lot of overlapping authorities and influences that come into play, and that's a big part of the challenge. The other big challenge revolves around a common question. Will it flood here? It seems like a simple question. People ask it all the time. It's the first question people ask when they're buying a house. When certain places, they might even be the first question asked when they're parking their car. It's also the question the public or stakeholders want to know if you're having them in a workshop setting. We know that to answer this, you need to know where here is, then you need to know how much rain falls, how fast it falls, where it falls, and the conditions on the ground when it falls. So once you know that, then you need to figure out how that quantity of water in that particular location, in those conditions, will move through and fill the landscape. We're talking, of course, about hydrology and hydraulics. So simply put, hydrology tells us how much water will be generated in a particular place from a storm. Hydraulics tells us where that water will go, both horizontally and vertically. Now, this seems like a simple enough process. And the challenge there, the problem is that if people think it's a simple process, if they think it's a simple thing to figure out, then they may not appreciate the complexity of stormwater or floodplain management, watershed management, what have you. So in these workshops, I like to offer up a tale of 2 dudes, particularly these 2 dudes. I ask who these people are. Now, at this point, I usually have a dramatic pause and people try and figure out who the other guy is. But since this is a recorded Zoom presentation, I'll just go right ahead and answer it. We all know the guy on the left is Albert Einstein. At least I hope we do, from our grade school textbooks. The guy on the right, you might be able to tell by his nose, is Hans Einstein. It's his son. He was a famous hydraulic engineering professor. His job was to figure out what water was going to do as it moved across the landscape. When reporters asked Albert what he thought of his son's career, he replied, "He is working on a more difficult problem." So if you come to that question, will it flood here, and you think that doesn't seem too hard to figure out, remember, the guy whose name we use as a synonym for genius thought figuring out how water moves through a landscape was a more difficult problem than what he worked on. So with that in mind, and considering why this is considered a more difficult problem by an Einstein, remember, flood risk is determined by how much runoff is generated in a particular landscape under a certain amount of rainfall. Both of those change over time. More than just jurisdictional lines on a map that we talked about, we've changed a lot and continue to change a lot on the ground. Each land use decision alters the way water drains from the landscape, and some of those changes are very small, but a lot of very small decisions can add up to a big impact, and that can impact our flood risk. Additionally, we want to point out that other things change too. It's not just our changes to the landscape. There's the specific amount of rainfall part that needs to go into figuring out if it's going to flood here. If you want to gauge how much flood water will be produced in a particular landscape, you need to know how much rain is going to fall. We base this on a defined storm event. We define storm events based on how likely they are to occur. This is called a recurrence interval or a return period, but in a more common parlance, people hear about the 100-year storm. That's an example of a defined storm. And these estimates are based on historical records, but some of those records are incomplete. Some of them may not be long enough to not have a big margin of error. And majority of them don't account for a changing climate. And even if you have an accurate record of rainfall, answering the question, will it flood here, is still difficult. You know, we refer to storms as 100-year storms. So take the 100-year storm for an example. Everybody thinks this is one storm, or I guess not everybody, but a lot of people do. And it simply means, you know, there's a 1% chance of it happening in a year. But which 100-year storm event are we talking about? Looking at this chart from NOAA's Atlas 14, that entire circled column is 100-year storm events. And so all of these are taking place over different periods of time, but when you hear about a 100-year storm event, you need to take into consideration how long it's been raining for and how intense that rainfall is. All of these lead to a big problem of answering, will it flood here? And finally, compounding all of that is this challenge of determining how much rain is going to fall and the complexity of climate change. Warmer temperatures hold more water vapor. What we're looking at here is statistics about very heavy rainfall events, defined as the heaviest 1% of all daily events in a year. And those have increased nationally in recent decades. So that question, will it flood here, is really difficult to answer. We have a changing landscape, and climate change is challenging our ability to accurately identify how much rain is going to fall and how frequently that's going to happen. So answering that question is really hard to do, but that doesn't mean we can't come up with a strategy to manage our flood risk and take steps to reduce it over time, even with all this uncertainty. So how do we do that? So at this point in our workshops, we kind of transition to discussing common strategies to manage stormwater and flood risk, which is necessary to discuss so that participants are familiar with them as they show up in the watershed game. So you'll recognize a lot of these. I'll kind of go through them a little quickly because I think we're mostly familiar with them. So that front piece, again, discusses the broader idea of watershed management, differentiates it from floodplain management, and how we conceptualize flood risk. These next several slides are going to directly discuss stormwater management strategies that participants are soon asked to consider employing in the watershed game. So we have two basic approaches here. We can manage the water itself, or we can manage the impacts of the floods that we know happen eventually. We have our traditional gray infrastructure. This is our stormwater infrastructure. It's typically man-made, constructed assets, called gray infrastructure because it's usually made out of cement or concrete. It's often watertight or impervious and designed with a single purpose. It's expensive to put in, expensive to maintain, but highly efficient. There's no quicker way to move water. We talk about green infrastructure and how we're trying to recapture some natural processes or engineering features to mimic natural processes. It's been around a long time, but it's growing in popularity as we realize we have a lot of opportunities to use it. Works to restore natural water retention capacity to the landscape. And it also provides additional benefits, some of which are never even factored into a cost-benefit analysis when you're considering your approach to stormwater management. We kind of highlight how gray infrastructure and green infrastructure aren't mutually exclusive. They often work together, as this example on the right. We talk about different aspects of the built environment, from an individual rain barrel on a house to slow down that water from entering a drainage system, to green roofs that kind of capture some stormwater before it ever gets to the ground. We kind of talk about things people would be familiar seeing in their neighborhood or at a shopping center, a bioswale or a rain garden. We alert them to the importance of street trees or the specific design of rainwater trees on urban environments, and as we see in the picture on the right there. We also want to make sure that they're aware that managing stormwater, managing flood risk doesn't always take place in front of their house or in an urban environment. Right, we can reconnect floodplains. In this example here, we see a river that had a levee setback to make room for the river to reconnect those floodplains. There's also the idea of conservation and restoration, right? Maintaining green space in urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas, not draining wetlands, or reclaiming some areas that may have had homes built on them. There's an example from New Orleans of some properties that were turned back into a large water retention site. That now is also a community amenity. So we're trying to drive home that there's a lot of options here. And then we move on to flood impacts, right? How do you manage flood impacts? Well, the best way to do it is to let people build in a risky place in the first place. So zoning's a way of doing that, right? You make sure that people can't develop in any density in a place that's vulnerable to flood risk. Then there's also environmental protection rules that preserve important habitat and helps buffer those floodwaters. We talk about housing design a little bit, or I guess building design, right? You can consider how they're built, and you can, if you know that there's a flood risk, you can elevate them, as we have a classic example from Louisiana here. Or, unfortunately, some infrastructure is in a risky place, and you have the option of flood proofing. We also talk about managing flood impacts, right? So, a lot of as development goes out, you have design standards for your development and how much you can fill in the floodplain, or freeboard requirements. And all of these regulations and development codes are just additional tools for accounting for the management of flood impacts. What we're really trying to drive home with this front part is just that it's a complex issue. You can't just count on getting the water out of your community as quickly as possible, and that there's a lot of strategies to dealing with this, and in the right hands, these strategies can complement one another. We also want to get people to start thinking that, there are unintended consequences to our decisions. There could be equity or environmental justice issues. What are the results of our decisions, and how can we mitigate any negative consequences to that? With climate change and relative sea level rise, especially in Louisiana, there's this challenge, and growing communities and population increases. In a lot of ways, we can't look to the past to address future challenges. We have to come up with a new approach to that. And then from a watershed management perspective, a watershed approach, we really are thinking about working across political lines and highlight this idea of, well, if we all work together, perhaps we can come to a better end result. So with all that kind of brings us to the watershed game. I will say it was a lot of fun to create. My coworkers and I just lots of time in the conference room, kind of laying it out, going through different iterations of it. We're real proud of it. It's been really great, and I can't stress enough how much I am enjoying being able to share this with all of you. So we developed this game to give anyone who's interested, landowners, elected officials, community stakeholders, the knowledge and tools to consider stormwater management decisions, to understand programs and policies available for a comprehensive approach to managing stormwater, and also to serve Louisiana's goal of moving towards a watershed approach to this, the potential for coordination across political boundaries to manage stormwater. So to play the game, we take our workshop participants and have divided up into groups of no more than 5 or 6 people. That's a good size for making sure that everybody gets their voice heard and nobody really gets talked over. And each are given one of 3 game boards that you'll see in a second that represent general land use contexts found across much of the country. So the game breaks it up into a rural community, a suburban community, and an urban community. And each area comes with a unique water management scenario, and these can always be modified to better reflect local challenges wherever this workshop's being held, and wherever the game's being played. So we highlight some things that happen in each of these different development contexts. So in rural areas, you may have wetlands drained and forests cleared for agriculture, and maybe a few homes are built in low-lying areas. In suburban areas, we take that one step further. We go agricultural land turns into subdivisions and commercial developments. You had some fill brought in, you lost some natural areas, and then there's more impermeable surfaces. In urban areas, maybe roads are expanded, more parking lots are built, buildings and homes got larger, and increased the amount of impermeable surfaces, and the limited amount of open space in the urban community was lost. This part of the scenario came from one of the first workshops we did, in which somebody had an issue with making these decisions at the watershed, for the watershed, in which there wasn't already public outreach and there wasn't communication and you didn't get input. So now we say, you are your community stormwater management planning committee. There have been extensive community public-wide meetings and educational materials, and now it's up to you. You have the trust of your community to make this decision. So in our workshop, we use the Amite watershed in Louisiana, but again, it's not specific to a particular watershed. Any watershed in combination of upstream to downstream regions can be used. In this case, it went from rural, downstream to suburban, downstream to urban. We call them Ruralville, Suburbana, and Urbanopolis. And you're responsible for making decisions how you manage your stormwater, and those decisions only apply to your area. So the goal is to manage your water, which we represent with glass pieces that we count out for you within your budget. We use poker chips for that. And then we've created a series of action cards in which the decisions you make are described on it, and there's costs and benefits for that. So the way the game's played, you kind of review these game materials to discuss those actions available. You prioritize which of those programs or policies that you want to use to build consensus. And then you start laying them out on that board from your first preference to lowest. You then pay for your actions and see if you can take care of all the water you will have. Do you consider using a regional policy or program? That comes a little later in the game once you realize you can't pay or if you can't account for all of your water. And then there's a good discussion as a group of the benefits and the trade-offs of the decisions made. And this all happens just in that during the gameplay. So just to go through some of the action cards, to go through the action cards and the features on them, we have our title. We have an indication if it's a program or a policy. We have a description of what that is, just to kind of return to that a little bit. We show them how much water it manages, and we share with them the cost. On the back of the cards, we list some basic pros and cons of this strategy. And we also, on all of these cards, we have a regional comparison of costs. So on this one, they're all the same, but in some areas, if you're conserving natural areas, you could say it costs more in an urban environment because land values are higher there. So there is have a comparative advantage for certain strategies based on cost of land or availability of land. So just to quickly go through the rest of the cards, you can expand your drainage infrastructure, you can construct a large-scale detention feature, conserve natural areas and other open space. You have a program for private green infrastructure, you can implement public green infrastructure, you have private property buyouts, you can adopt freeboard, you can restrict fill in the floodplain, you can adopt or increase storm event design standards. Everybody's favorite, you can increase community revenue through taxes or fees. Actually, not the least favorite card in here. I believe that was property buyouts. You can conduct an educational campaign. This was another feature of the game that came out of one of our first scoping workshops. And somebody said, you need an educational campaign so that we can build support behind some of these other programs. We also have a blank card. We don't claim to be omniscient, and lots of people have good ideas. So all of these materials are laminated. And, people are encouraged to write all over them with dry erase markers to provide some feedback on that. We can adopt a regional policy. So once you get through the game, you have regional options available. Facilitators encourage your table to explore those options to see if they can come up with a more efficient or less costly way to manage their stormwater. The one condition is that all the jurisdictions have to participate in that coordination. So if you put forward a policy or a program, everybody has to agree on this, and it's interesting seeing everybody kind of debate which ones they should. And then this is also encouraged by kind of cooking the books at the front end so that you either have not enough funds or too much water, with the game pieces to create buyers and sellers of this, of programs and policies. Again, we have a blank one for a regional strategy in case somebody comes up with something better. And then the conversations that happen both in a report out and at the table are things like who benefits and loses from these strategies, what are the short-term and long-term costs, who bears the cost of maintenance or compliance of your choices, how might they impact economic development, and then who bears or shares the costs from regional coordination. What we found this game does in a really enjoyable way is start the conversation that educates people on options through an engaging activity that requires prioritization of a broad selection of strategies. That's a really valuable takeaway. You don't just end up with a list of what people want, you end up with a list of preferences that have been weighed against a variety of other options. They've been a really great vehicle for talking about watershed management strategies with groups whose interests might not obviously intersect. It does a good job of starting from a common ground. We've hosted these workshops with a range of participants, various NGO partners, housing organizations, even grade school students. Each group tailors the gameplay and discussions slightly to better fit their own interests. For instance, when we played with the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, they generated a great conversation about how policies and programs to manage water intersect with housing affordability and who really shoulders the costs for implementation and enforcement. Some additional takeaways that we've had, some observations. Players often assume roles representing diverse voices within a community, whether that's developers, elected officials, homeowners, or just John Q. taxpayer. We find that communication is key, right? Players requested cards, like conduct an educational campaign. And then actions are also often coupled, right? People are looking at these and they say, well, the only way we're doing buyouts is if we also conserve natural areas. And so they kind of have contingencies in there. Also, some people do come in and they play to win. They just look at that cost benefit analysis, but almost always there's somebody else at their table that challenges them and who are really considering the consequences of decisions. We were often surprised by the depth of discussion on the relationships between certain strategies. Like what's elevation got to do with floodplain management? People want to discuss those. Also, every game has been different, depending on who's sitting at the table, different geographies, different types of users, different politics, all of the above. And then finally, when I asked my coworkers, what are your takeaways from this? This was my favorite response. It's, dudes, let's work together. So there's always a moment in every game where people realize they're gonna have to make some tough decisions to manage their water. Remember, we cook the books ahead of time. And they reassess their decisions and they look to the regional options. And that's when the negotiating and the fun starts and the reasoning takes place. Some groups like to play hardball. Others want to capitalize on the opportunity to get rid of a program or policy that they're not too fond of. As a facilitator, hearing folks argue for or against certain strategies, hearing them articulate their viewpoints, it's a very gratifying and useful outcome. So with that, I'll close by saying these workshops have been hosted and played, that we've hosted and played. The games have been great. Participants have engaged, debated, they've learned. It's been really rewarding as a facilitator. And as I've also learned from the game that their takeaway is they often have a much more positive outlook on what they're doing. So I want to thank you for your attention, and thanks once again to the ASFPM.